All right, so good afternoon, welcome back, and welcome to the session devoted to future practice of data governance. My name is Jean-Pierre Hubaux. I'm with EPFL, and I'm chairing the Laboratory for Data Security, and I'm also the academic director of C4DT. We'll have distinguished, let's say, a panel of distinguished specialists, as you can see from the slide, and so we'll have actually 4 speakers. What we will do is that we will try to keep the questions for the end, to have a little bit of discussion at the end of the session. Our first speaker is going to be Susan Aaronson, who is actually with George Washington University. Susan, thanks for joining us from the other side of the pond, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me get my PowerPoint up. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to talk about a project that we're just beginning, and I'd love to get some feedback on it. And that project is the Global Data Governance Project. So we know that data is valuable, but how do we govern data in ways that can foster goals that we should all want, such as innovative inclusion, equity, and democracy? Because as you all probably know, the global market for data is huge. We've all learned how important data is to serving our lives in terms of COVID-19. And the last estimate that I've seen for the US government is the US government has estimated the global market for data at about 20 billion, of which the US market is about 3/4 of that, 15.2 billion. So that's large, but as you know, it's characterized by information asymmetries. China and the US dominate that market. And as you can read here, I won't go into the specifics. China and the US have so much of this, whereas Europe's share of the value of these platforms is about 4%, and Africa and Latin America together is only 1%. So issues of equity are clear here. So because of that, I think we need to think about how people around the world see these markets. And what I see when I look at the WTO talks as examples that developing country policymakers, just as with intellectual property rights, fear that policies designed to govern data are designed to cement market dominance and to achieve comparative advantage in data, which I can talk about in a minute. So what are they doing? They're acting to change that situation. First thing they're doing is they want to have sovereignty over their data. So they're using lots of strategies, including, for example, Gaia X to create their own clouds. Okay, but they need to think about what that means to, as the last panel discussed, trust, to innovation, and to the supply of data. And they, in so doing, if they reduce cross-border data flows, these nations may risk less competition and less innovation. Meanwhile, other open economies such as Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore are trying to create a new approach that is built on trust, but also builds the data economy in other countries. So working together, these trade agreements are called, for example, the Digital Economy Agreement and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. Meanwhile, the EU is innovating in ways that I think are really important, creating a data space for the mixing of public and proprietary data, and understanding that the future of data-driven sectors are in that mix. But the key question is, who owns the data, who controls the data, and who owns and controls the results? And in my view, governments are increasingly acting like platforms. And I would say that criticism is true for the US, for Canada, and certainly for the EU. So the thing is, we don't know what comprehensive data governance looks like and what it means for the data-driven economy. So what we're trying to do is learn how nations govern several types of data. So The World Bank this year, the World Development Report looked at public and personal data, and we go beyond that to look at personal, proprietary, public, and cross-border data flows. Right now, we have funding to do a desk study of 40 countries, looking at what are they doing regarding governing each of these types of data and regarding the mixing of data. And how are they innovating? For example, collective data rights, which is, I think, the future of personal data protection. Collective data rights means you don't just think about privacy, protecting privacy. You think about how personal data protection is a collective right, not just an individual right. It can affect freedom of association online. It can affect freedom of speech online. So that's an example of a new approach. And then we want to see if governments are trying to achieve comparative advantage in data using their data governance. And what does comparative advantage look like? Is it having economies of scale and scope for data? Or is it, as the EU seems to be trying to do, facilitating the mix of data? So if anybody here would like to see the questionnaire, it will be up on our website, but not today. So you can email me at this email address, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Susan, thanks a lot. This is indeed, I think you pointed out a number of issues that would deserve a long debate. So as mentioned, we'll keep, can you stay with us until the end, or do you have to skip?
We have a webinar at 10:30, so I got to leave it at like 9:22 or something like that, 9:25, my time. So
your time, so 3:20. Okay, I see.
I mean 10:25, my mistake.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
we have time. Thank you.
Good. Okay, very good. So then we'll move to the next speaker. So thanks a lot again, Suzanne. So the next speaker is Jeff Bohn, who is director at the director of the Swiss Re Institute. Swiss Re is actually one of the founding partners of C4DT, who is one of the main organizers of this event. So thanks a lot, Jeff, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about some of the specific issues that are relevant in the insurance or the reinsurance industry. So maybe a slightly different take, but a lot of the same types of questions that are arising. I just quickly wanted to mention that the Swiss Re Institute, as it's now nearly 4 years old. It's the culmination of pulling together a lot of the different R&D efforts within Swiss Re, and certainly data and figuring out how to do a better job of using data is a big topic for us. But I wanted to start with explaining a shift that's been going on in the insurance industry for the past several years. It's hard to say when this really started, but certainly in the last decade and a half. Before, insurance was really about just understanding the risks. Then you design an insurance contract, figure out how to cover that, and you take the premia, and then if there's an event, a downside event, you then pay the claim. That has now shifted to becoming much more predict and prevent, and this is still a work in progress for the industry, but the point here is that insurance now just becomes one part of a portfolio of services related to risk management, resilience as a service. And if you want to use the kind of the manufacturing metaphor, we need to have some kind of fuel to do this work. And that fuel is really data, plus machine intelligence to put it all together. But this shift towards predicting and preventing and providing, say, resilience as a service, that becomes a much more data intensive type effort than even before. Traditionally, insurance does have a lot of data in it, but we never really considered it to be big data until we started thinking about some of these other applications. Now, the problem is that despite this shift and this ambition to try to use the data in more creative ways. Unfortunately, the last 10 or 15 years of attempts have not gone terribly well. Now I use machine intelligence as an umbrella term because it could be anything as simple as just conventional curve fitting, but it could also be more complicated or sophisticated AI or machine learning. Regardless of how you define it, at the enterprise level, it just still hasn't done very well. And often the problem relates back to data. And it's the whole range of questions around data governance, data management, and also data distribution to getting the right people inside your organization using that data. Now we see in insurance these parallel trends that are all related back to data, and I use this metaphor of data as the new oil. I like it because oil needs to be refined to become useful, and I think it's the same thing with data. Data needs to be refined in some way. You have to derive analytics out of the data in some way, or you may have to match data that you're receiving, say, off of an IoT device against some thresholds. In any case, you have to do some kind of refinement. Now, the trends that are creating this opportunity are a mix of Internet of Things, increasing bandwidth, such as in 5G, advances in machine intelligence, as well as things like distributed ledger technology. And all of these are coming together to create this new opportunity. And then in the context of this, we're very focused as an insurance industry, and I think probably we should all be focused on these topics anyway, around climate change and natural resource management. Again, this is all a function of how we're using data and the increasing availability of data, even though it's not always nice and clean and formatted. So if you look at the data value chain, the way that we create value for us, and this is probably true for all enterprises, is not just in the generate and collection stage, but it's much more focused on these two middle pillars, the organize and curate and the analyze and transform. Now, the industry has overinvested on the analyze and transform step. In fact, we've done some research within the Swiss Re Institute that even backs that up also with some data and evidence, and not enough investment on organize and curate, which I'm starting to see a shift. There's more people talking about this, but I think this is a very important point, at least from the insurance perspective. We can talk a lot about data, we can talk a lot about data-driven decision-making, and we can have all these great new tools that transform the data into useful output. But if it's not curated well, I think it's analogous to putting sand in the gas tank of a car, and even though you spend a lot of time building the car, it just doesn't run very well. And I think that's very true in a lot of the enterprise deployments that we see. So that means that for us in insurance, it's just critical that we improve the data ingestion and curation capabilities, as well as shift the paradigm of data being a stock asset. I think this is still true, where you search around either on the internet, on an internal data repository, and try to find a pool of data or a lake of data, and then put it into some kind of calculation tool or software. And I think that we need to shift to get a lot of the value out of it, shift it to more of a flow asset where you're plugging into pipelines. And that means that we have to think more carefully about how we curate the data. How are we handling missing data? How are we dealing with outliers? And then there's a whole range of questions with respect to whether the data is useful. And then overarching is governance rules and privacy rules, which are almost more important than even some of these other engineering questions, at least for our use cases within insurance. The other huge opportunity is synthesizing the unstructured data. So this is text and audio and maybe even potentially video in the future, and using that as a way of improving the quality of the derived output. And just to give you a quick example there, I know of some situations where processing local unstructured data. So these are blogs or even newsletters that you might have at a municipal level. That can actually help you do a better job of predicting trends in potential losses, in potential litigation. These are all questions that are of interest to insurance, but also environmental issues that might arise. There's this whole trend in asset management and also in insurance around focusing on environmental, social, and governance issues. This is the ESG, and often it's the unstructured data that allows us to do a better job of assessing ESG impact, and it's also potentially improving the predictive capability of the models. This is just all to say that there's a huge opportunity if we can do a better job of processing unstructured data. Just to give you a sense of that, we estimate somewhere between 80 to 90% of the potentially valuable unstructured data currently today is not being curated. The other opportunity is figuring out how to use confidential computing capabilities to extract data that's normally not available. And here I just have a few statistics that we pulled out of some research that we found. You know, right now, only 3% of financial services in the UK are using machine learning to gain actionable insight from unstructured data. And when you drill into that, often it's a privacy issue. We're seeing a trend based on some of the new reports as recently as October 2020 that half of large firms are now talking about implementing privacy enhancing computation or privacy preserving analytics. That said, we still find that consent and preference management platforms in enterprises, or the adoption is still low. So that, and actually, when you don't have those types of systems or platforms in place, particularly in Europe and other jurisdictions, you just can't use that data. So it becomes unavailable for use in analytics. And as I mentioned, a lot of the data that we think is potentially valuable, but also behind these privacy walls are unstructured data. Now that brings me to this very interesting trend, which is confidential computing, and this is an exciting area. In fact, we're doing some joint work through the Center for Digital Trust with JP's team at EPFL, as well as some other partners. But you can see confidential computing is just starting to move up this hype cycle. So this innovation trigger has been pulled. In fact, in a recent presentation, I probably should have changed this slide. I had a couple of people push back and say that it's probably going to be more like a 2 to 3 year wait, not a 5 to 10 year wait. So things are moving quite quickly in this space. Now, if we come up with ways to manage both the input privacy and the output privacy in this data context, and I don't have time to go through all of the different issues that are related there, which range from aggregation to authentication of even identity, and then making sure that it all complies with existing data regulations. But this is the goals that we see in the system, and there are multiple techniques that we think are needed to address those privacy goals. Now, if we kind of put that all together, this is really quite an exciting area in the data governance, data privacy space, with this umbrella label of confidential computing. Now that encompasses a lot of different things. There's already been a lot of discussion about differential privacy. So this is really where, you know, potentially you use noise added to certain data or wall off certain components of data. But we're now seeing a shift toward what I think are more robust solutions for our types of use cases, where we really want to get access in a machine learning context to some of the underlying granular data. And this may come from having multiple contributors to some kind of data calculation effort. This could, you know, for us as a reinsurer, this could be multiple direct insurers. For healthcare providers, which is another area that's of relevance to us because we have a lot of life and health portfolios, it would be nice to have these secure multi-party computation platforms up so that you could have data contributed it could stay protected, but still have the benefit of using analytics to derive output. And then some of the newer techniques are the software techniques such as fully homomorphic encryption, where you can run the analytics on the encrypted data. And then there's a whole host of hardware-based solutions that are being offered both in the cloud context and also at the CPU level, where you're in essence creating a trusted execution environment. And that would be the only place where potentially the data are vulnerable. This all interacts with these developing technologies in the edge computing space, as well as distributed ledgers, which solves a different problem, but often for us, they need to be combined. So if I want data immutability arising from, say, distributed ledger or blockchain, often I also need some kind of trusted execution environment or a way to maintain privacy to get the full value, particularly in the context of doing resilience as a service or trying to come up with predictive models. So this is an exciting space that I think unlocks a lot of new data that has not traditionally been available to insurance for modeling. So in conclusion, where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a lot of very interesting opportunities. And this is, the bread and butter of an organization like the Swiss Re Institute is coming up with ways to do better decision making. That could be risk models, that could be resilience models, that could be predictive models. These are almost always data-driven applications. We are seeing demand for advanced analytics capabilities, some of the new machine learning and AI algorithms that are of interest, but have been troublesome just given the inability to access the data that we need to really run them, and that's slowly changing. This will promote more innovation and competition. We do also think regulators have an important part to play in all of this, and we're very collaborative with the regulators as we try to develop a healthy balance of data availability, but still respecting privacy and controlling how that data are used. And this should lead to better products and services and better recommendations for the clients, as well as new types of services for insurance customers, as I mentioned, not just insurance, could be resilience services, could be risk management services. Many challenges are still in the way, just around competition, non-compliance risk. I think this limits the speed of innovation, but I think it makes sense for insurance. We don't want to get tripped up, so we don't move as quickly as some people would like us to, but I think that makes sense. We're still addressing questions of privacy and bias in the algorithms. This fourth point is probably the most important. The data is still quite noisy. We need more investment in engineering and architecture. And this all leads to handling these other challenges, such as breaching customer privacy, cyber attack risk, and a whole host of issues around responsible use of data and responsible ML and AI. How are we using the data and making sure we're not leaking sensitive information in the process of doing those calculations and generating a new portfolio of derived analytics. So overall, it's despite the disappointment in the enterprise deployment of a lot of these new technologies and the fact that we still have quite fragmented data infrastructures, I think the trend is definitely positive, and I look forward to seeing the further development as we figure out these new opportunities from the mix of data and machine intelligence as it applies to insurance. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, we are doing very well in terms of time, so thanks to Susan and you for having been so compact. Maybe we can take at this point one question, because it is really specific to your talk, if you don't mind, Jeff, which is about the question from Pilar Fajarnes. So with regard to data in insurance, which are the sources of data considered? So when talking about going further to videos, would this mean that insurance companies could get data from social media and determine risks and offering insurance contract or not on the basis? So how broad do you envision to be able to go?
Well, you're talking to an R&D person. So I think that it could be very broad. You know, the trouble that we have seen in trying to apply some of these new technologies is that sometimes the counter response is faster than we would like. You know, so for example, there were a lot of early deployment of automated claims processing using smartphone video. So that's an example of processing video data. But then with the advent of what are called generative adversarial networks, or GANs, it became quickly possible to trick these algorithms. And you know, I think people have now figured out how to manage that, but there's a bit of an arms race that does go on as you try to shift to a fully digitized model. I didn't talk about it so much in this presentation, but I think it's quite important that we don't take humans out of the loop. So often when I talk about using data or using technology, it's about intelligently automating in a human-centric way. And that can solve some of these problems. But in terms of where this is headed, yeah, I think it could be quite broad.
Okay, thanks a lot. And then Susan, are you still with us?
I just shut off my picture. Yes,
Okay.
I am still here.
Good, because I understand you have to leave us soon, right? And so I wanted to. So
No, at 10:25-ish.
Yeah, exactly. Which
Yeah.
which means that because you know, the overall discussion is going to take place after that. So before you have to leave, I had a question with respect to the one piece of information that you brought that I think is really crucial, namely that out of the $20 billion roughly of world you know, relevance for the data market, around 75%, so 15 billion is actually US, right? Which means that permanently Europeans who have a very tiny share of that pie are in a kind of defensive and reactive mode, right? And GDPR is typically an illustration of this phenomenon, with the risk that in the long run, this will undermine trust between the two blocks, right? In the sense that some US companies have become extremely good and talented and organized to essentially extract these data from Europe. And it is unlikely that European, let's say, tech giants are going to emerge and will counterbalance the thing. It is happening in the case of China, of course, right? Because they took different measures to protect us, to shield themselves, you know, from Facebook and the like. But in Europe, this is not the case, right? So how do you see a path towards a kind of you know, you were talking about how misgovernance can be detrimental. So how to prevent, let's say, mistrust from growing between these two traditionally very friendly geopolitical blocs?
Well, first of all, I think leadership plays an important role in building trust. And only for the last 4 years, the United States has a leader who just does not understand the importance of trust and how fragile it is and how hard it is to regain it. Okay, that said, so I do think actually the Biden administration will work very hard to rebuild that trust and to work with our allies, particularly on China. But I want to get to the specifics of what your very thoughtful question, which is more about what, if I understand correctly, it's more about what can the EU do, or what can Canada do with without having these large firms that have economies of scale and scope and data. And as you know, innovation is not static. So yes, Chinese firms and US firms have the expertise, they have the capital, and they have the data right now. So they're able to buy potential competitors. But I do think Europe is taking, in my mind, a very thoughtful approach in some areas. And one of those areas is thinking about how do we create a trusted environment for various types of data? So whether that data is proprietary data, public data, or personal data, and all those groups can have, you know, those two groups can have personal data in them. But how do you create this trusted environment to encourage innovation? Those are the questions I think they're trying to ask with the data space. And I think that has huge opportunities because in the United States, this is so odd to me, but the United States sees this as a street going from public data to the private sector. What can the private sector do to analyze public data to help us solve RICA problems or improve governance? What the EU says is it says this relationship can go both ways. And so I think focusing on data governance can help, is my hypothesis, improve comparative advantage in innovative areas built on data. But we'll see if that hypothesis is right. The other economies are taking different approaches, right? I really have to applaud Chile, New Zealand, Singapore, Australia, who have built these digital economy partnerships where they say, we can't govern data without trust. So trust has to be at the bottom of everything we do. But we have to collaborate to build the digital economy. And so that's what these agreements do. And I hope that they will serve as models for what's going on at the WTO in terms of global governance of data. But we don't know because those negotiations are secret. But I actually think focusing on competition policy, for example, to regulate Facebook and Google, again, this is different from software, but I think we've learned that competition policy always moves too slow and it solves the problem of last year. And you and I can't predict the problems of tomorrow. So I think we have to create an environment, all that UK stuff of regulatory sandboxes, where we think about how can we innovate in ways that achieve the goals that we want to see. And I see my goal as the head of this, the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub is a training camp. What we do is we provide free education to policymakers in the US and the UK, and we've also worked in Canada and Argentina. Whatever they want to learn about related to these issues, we'll bring in the experts for them to train them or to do seminars, because I think we all have a lot to learn from each other. Nobody knows how to do this right. It's changing so rapidly and it is so tainted by fears, for example, fears of AI.
Absolutely. Very good. Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thanks for being with us. And now we'll move to the third presentation. The third speaker is Olivier Crochat. So Olivier is someone with whom I work almost on a daily basis. He's the Executive Director of the Center for Digital Trust. So he joined us in April 2018. And Olivier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. So, yes. I think we heard from the two previous talk quite interesting information on data security and also data governance. And my first slide, you'll see, it's just the idea was a bit like what is the mood right now from the general public concerning data. And I took this from the quote is from The Great Hack, the documentary on the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and Carol Cadvalad, the journalist from The Guardian, said this sentence, and I think it's quite interesting because there you have like personal data out there against, and we do not understand, and that's a bit the feeling about the data. There is this importance of protection of the data, and that it's used somewhere out there, and then we don't understand really what it's done and who does what, and that it could be used against us. It's not only for us or for the society, but it's also against us. And there is this feeling right now. So it's interesting there. And also we've heard this morning and just right now by Jeff, the idea of data is the new oil. And I think Katharina Höhne this morning had nice analogies concerning this one. And also it's interesting to understand, she mentioned the fact that data is not decision. and it's out of data you take some decision, and that's where we need to ensure that the data is used in a secure way there. So I think the awareness is raising on this topic. I placed the cursor here in 2013 for the first time when Ross Ulbricht, the founder of Silk Road on the dark net, was arrested by the FBI and sentenced to life imprisonment, in fact, because he was selling a lot of stuff, developing a platform to sell a lot of stuff, but on it also, he was selling data like password and username. It could be a list of credit card information or numbers. And I think that's where we came to know that, yes, data has a value and a commercial value. And even if it's illegal to sell it, it's something that is done. So this cyber criminality, the same year, 2013, we had the Edward Snowden revealing the spying and mass surveillance from states on other states, but also on the citizen. And so this type of cyber warfare, it's interesting also because we were talking about mass surveillance, and the amount of data leakage was also massive. US official mentioned 1.7 million documents that were leaked, or confidential documents that were leaked. And finally, so that's about the geopolitical advantage of data, owning data and using it. And finally, in 2018, I mentioned already the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and I think that's where the general public came to know that, yes, personal data, what we do on the internet is data and is stored, and it could be used by companies, but it could just to sell us product or for a commercial advantage, but it could also be used by groups or states to influence us. And I think that was quite interesting because there is this economic advantage there, legal or illegal maybe, but also the geopolitical one. And that's where we need to place the red line also. Is it tailored ads on your Google page or Facebook? Is it okay or not? Keeping you online as long as possible by pushing contents that you like, so that you will spend more, or people will be able to sell your data more online. Is it something that we agree or not? And finally, influencing you, like what we noticed in the elections process. Where is the red line? What is admittable or not? So I think it was interesting there also. So I mentioned the fact that data is at risk. So it has value, so it's at risk. And what are the risks? There is the risk on the data itself. It could be copied if it's confidential information, if it's commercially important information that you own or as a company. And this could be done, the copy could be done without even you noticing. And also once done, it's easy to duplicate. So multiple times. So that's one of the problem of data compared to physical goods. That's this type of easy duplication. And also it could be changed. You could have important data stored, or you could retrieve data to perform some analysis or computation. And if this data is changed and noticed, then you will have the wrong results, and it could be dangerous. It could be dangerous there. And also the data could be destroyed. So you store data and then suddenly you don't have it anymore. You cannot do anything there. It's interesting to know that stealing data or stealing something in the physical world could be mapped for data to say, first you copy it and then you destroy it. And so the person don't have it anymore. That's the risk we have on the data, but we also have risks on data usage. And I think that's what Jeff mentioned lately, or in the previous presentation. He said that we need to secure the organize and curate data and the analyze and transform data. That's how we use the data, and we ensure that there is no bias by machine learning. We've mentioned this morning, like the things the gender bias or the racial bias, all those type of things we could have, and how to protect data from this. And I think the risk there, it's important, because when we talk about a large amount of data and huge amount of data and machine learning, then we human, most of the time, we cannot see if there was a flow in the process or in the data. We have the results and we don't know how come the results are coming. So and we need to trace that back, and it's really hard to do that. So I think the data is at risk there, definitely. And as mentioned by Suzanne also before, we have these data surveillance, and it's really a massive surveillance that we have. And I'm not even talking about the actions of the states. I'm also talking about, like, you read a book on your Kindle. Amazon will track what you read, the speed at which you read, will track the dictionary entries you look for, and all of this information might have some value there. And it's also hidden. You don't know that. The things I've mentioned, most of the people don't know that. If you're on Instagram and you stop browsing, or you swipe something, everything is tracked. So that type of things you don't know. And it's automatized now. The huge amount of data are being tapped or used and processed, and with processing power, with storing power, it's cheap, a lot cheaper than before. So you have these things are quite fully automatized, and also it's ubiquitous in that sense. I mean, even if you're not online, let's say your parents have no Google account or Facebook account, but you have one. They are in your contact. You have you have their address. You have their birth date. You store pictures with them on Google Drive, and all this information, even if you're not online, information about you will be stored. So I think that's quite interesting. And for example, the funny fact, like Ross Ulbricht from Silk Road, he got caught by the FBI because in the early days of Silk Road, he used a nickname, Altoid, that he used when he was much younger on a programming forum, and with his real email address at that time. And the FBI managed to get this data. So it's stored forever, and it could be used forever. So I think it's important there. So we've mentioned the threats on the data, and I think we've talked about this also earlier today. The internet is not secure, and we've mentioned that by previous in the previous session also. Communication, and I think something which is interesting is we thought earlier or up to recently that communication and data and transparency were good for democracies. And lately, with the misinformation, manipulation of data, it seems that huge amount of data, manipulation of data favors more really authoritarian regimes and people not in favor of democracy. So it's quite an interesting point there also. And the internet is not secured, and mainly internet is not secure due to states not wanting it to be secured. A few states doing anything not to have a secure internet there. So concerning data governance, and Susan talked about that earlier, I think it's really important to have governments at a macro level to take some actions there. To push for stronger international rules, to push for attribution and accountability on the internet. And also there are some initiatives like the Safe Harbor, GDPR. We could even mention the Cloud Act, where you have some legal rules, but not all goes in the right direction, to be honest. So at a micro level, corporation needs to have some action there also. They need to collaborate with the government, but they also need to take actions to protect the data they have. That means cybersecurity of the data, but also fair use of the data. And Jeff mentioned that in his talk. I think it's rather important there. And they need to discuss also with the government. I think Brad Smith from Microsoft had an interesting term. He mentioned the technoplasy for technology and diplomacy, and that people need to work together and on promoting a safe usage of the data and ensuring that accountability too. And finally, at the nano level, I would say the citizen society, or the civil society and the citizen, have to take actions there also. We need to, what we want to have, we need to support the data protection, and we need to push to get our state and our governments to act on this one. And also we need to, at a personal level, we need to act. We need to, I know it's not easy, but we might promote applications that have a fair usage of data. We need to deinstall some of those and to really to weight the gain or the benefits from the applications we are using compared to the potential damages. So we've talked about data protection, and I think it's really something where all the stakeholders need to act and to work upon. I had this because we're doing the technical side of the data protection, I think, and most of the things I'm mentioning here on how to protect data, Jeff mentioned a few earlier on, so I will not spend too much time there, but really when you generate data, you need to have trusted execution environment. And also when you process data, it could be some place where you could improve the things here. And during the collection of data, the data transfer is really could be a problem, and encryption, end-to-end encryption and anonymous communication networks are things where we could protect data here over the course of the events. And there are a lot of research done there here at EPFL on these topics. So securing data is an important subject, and here at the Center for Digital Trust, we bring all the stakeholders together to discuss those issues. It's not only technology, but it's also ethical, societal, or legal challenge. And we need this platform to do the collaboration. We have research institute, more than 34 labs. We had corporations working together with us, and also the governments with the Swiss strategies and international initiatives. And we have this collaboration platform, and we've developed a lot of things, like we have 6 demonstrators or proof of concept. We've had 20 bilateral projects with the industry. We've run more than 50 training seminars or conferences over the past 3 years. There is a need for that, and it's interesting to see that we work together to address this issue. If you are interested in research, feel free to contact us. We've had talks from professors from EPFL this morning, Professor Troncoso West or Professor Hubaux. And we do a lot of work also on formal software verification, cybersecurity, decentralized or adversarial machine learning, or any type of digital ledger technology. So feel free to contact us. And just to finish, if you're interested in the subject, I found those 3 books rather interesting, non-technical books, and it's a good read for all of us, I think. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer or discuss later on in the Q&A session.
Good. Thanks a lot, Olivier. So we'll take now the 4th and last speaker. Rory Macmillan is going to talk actually about trust, power, and the broadening scope of data governance. So, Rory, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So Susan started us off talking about the international global scene approach to data governance, and then Jeff took us into the enterprise, in the insurance sector, which is really where I think notions of data governance originated. And then Olivier's brought us back out into awareness raising and really risk across society of data governance issues. What I'm going to do is in drawing on some work that we've been doing in the American Bar Association Task Force on Big Data, at the ITU on Big Data and Digital Financial Inclusion, and then at the World Bank on data governance, is using the lens of the financial sector, talk a bit about data governance as the issues are evolving. So I'm going to ask you if you could, if you would just go to the your browser, and if you would mind, as I'm speaking, you'll be able to tell me which of these scenarios I'm describing. We have a health insurance company, imagine this, which gives you points for checking your blood pressure, your blood glucose, cholesterol, your weight, your waist circumference, gives you a wearable band that maintains every step, monitors every step, every heartbeat, gives you points for the number of steps you take, withholds points if you don't, asks you to do a minimum number of hours of cardio exercise every week. It measures them by cardio rate, calculated by subtracting your age from 220. It gives you points and withholds them if you don't meet the minimum exercise target. It reminds you, it nudges you if the week is getting to a close and you're short of almost the 3 hours that you're supposed to do. Now, imagine this health insurance company is also a bank, and every purchase using the bank card is monitored. They follow whether you're buying vegetables, and they give you points if you're buying vegetables. And they withhold points if you're buying chocolate. And of course, the number of points that you are earning affects the price of your health insurance. Prizes are thrown in, like 30% off a holiday at the beach. And the bank has access not only to the device data on your steps and heartbeat, but all your health data. And they can take all of that into account when they're assessing your credit score when you ask for a loan. So, is this a UK fintech company? Is this China's social credit score system? Is it an episode of the British TV series Black Mirror, if any of you have seen that? Or is it a sub-Saharan Africa scenario provider? Well, let me tell you, this is the Discovery Vitality Program from South Africa, which is a hugely attractive and successful program. The middle class of South Africa love it. They're using it. They're a little uncomfortable about it, but they are using it extensively. And so this is a model that is being taken up very quickly in countries which are lacking substantial data protection. So I'm going to now stop sharing my screen. If maybe Michael can help me with that. Did you have, was that shown on the screen?
Yeah, it was, but now you're okay.
Good, thank you. So, good, and the screen has stopped showing, is that right?
Yes.
Excellent, good. So, today the notion of data governance is really broadened. It's gone far beyond the management of data by the enterprise as an asset, as a resource. You know, policymakers, legislators, regulators, everyone's trying to figure out what sorts of laws, regulations, institutions, decision-making processes should be used. And there's a wide range of issues now, from privacy to bias to antitrust. In the financial sector, which I want to talk a bit about, maybe more than any other sector, data governance is just profoundly vital. Why? Because finance is fundamentally about the process and the agents involved in allocating resources in the economy. It's driven by information very directly about supply and demand, opportunity and risk. So how information is organized is really fundamental to how markets themselves work, particularly financial markets. If you remember Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel laureate economist, he characterized this as a sort of knowledge problem. He said, if we possess all the relevant information, if we can start out from a given system of preferences, and if we command complete knowledge of available means, the problem which remains is purely one of logic. We only need to plug the right data into our calculus and issue orders. Now, he was saying that in the middle of the Cold War, with arguments between central communist control and free markets waging. He said the local specific knowledge of many different individuals and organizations in the market would be superior to the communist attempt at sort of centralized control. Centralized authoritative knowledge and decision-making would be limited by the inability to collect all the data about conditions on the ground and people's preferences and to compute it. Much better let people make millions and billions of individuals' decisions based on what each of them knows. The concept of price regulates how each of these decisions affects one another. So what kinds of information would go into the many pricing computations in financial markets? Well, there's always been some tension between what some would call traditional and alternative data. Data collected from numerous resources, online browsing, social media, credit card purchases, location data. But actually, the notion of alternative data it's only new in terms of its scope and its scale. Back in 1609 in Venice, Galileo showed his telescope to the Senate and showed how he could see the merchant ships arriving from far away, and that allowed traders on land to anticipate changes to prices in the market. In the 19th century, as modernity, industrialization was coming, urban concentration, migration, there was some rupture of social trust. It stretched distance between people, depersonalization, credit information on people, which had previously been quite informal, somewhat ad hoc, anecdotal. Two brothers, Lewis Tapham and Arthur, they set up something called the Mercantile Agency in 1830 to collect detailed information about business owners across the US. They produced ledgers organized, showing identities, assets, local reputations of businesses, of business people across the country. They abstracted that data and they sold subscriptions to a centralized reporting service. And now, sort of to echo Shoshana Zuboff's phrase and critique of surveillance capitalism, they defended their system, saying this is not a system of espionage, but the same as merchants usually employ, only on an extended plan to ascertain whether persons applying for credit are worthy of the same and to what extent. So with this back and forth between ways of data gathering that become institutionalized, as credit agencies have now, and then newer ways of gathering newer types of data, what do we care about when it comes to data governance, particularly in the financial sector? Well, I think a key part of this comes back to what Olivier was saying about trust and the system, particularly when it's the data being used for financial decision making. It's to make sure that the data is actually trustworthy for the productive economic purpose of the financial markets. It's been a central theme of financial regulation for a long, long time. Just to take, for example, securities regulators and stock markets, they will require disclosure of specified data to enable investors to assess companies and make informed investment decisions in financial markets. In that case, the responsibility for the accuracy of the data is decentralized. It remains with the companies that are reporting their data. The stock exchanges and securities regulators, they don't verify that data. The companies are responsible for it. Achieving the desired level of trust really relies on the institutions and processes that assess, validate, reduce the transaction costs of verifying claims that people make about themselves or that companies make about themselves. It's to make it easier to be able to assess that when making decisions about whether to lend to somebody or to grant them insurance. So back to credit reporting agencies. They're typically highly regulated now. They collect, they publish particular types of personal data to generate reputational data outputs, credit score, ranking. But today these models are coming under strain. Just mentioning the discovery example I gave you earlier, privacy is a huge issue that's now stretching these. It's always been there, as we know if you read, if any of you read Sarah Igo's book on her wonderful history on privacy, came out last year, I think. Trust and privacy have been there, very present throughout. But it's not just a question of how trusted data is organized for decision making. It's more about the information asymmetry and how much that should be allowed between individual subjects of decisions, so the consumers, and the financial service providers who know more about them all the time, who have this credit surveillance or surveillance capitalism working. There's something very disempowering about that level of asymmetry. And so privacy laws are seeking to strengthen the autonomy, the dignity of individuals by limiting what information can be gathered, used, passed onwards. So privacy is clearly going to be a major limiting condition in the drive for ever more perfect information for financial decision making. It kind of runs a little counter to the imperatives of big data that seeks to improve profiling based on as wide a range of data types as possible. Now, the broadening use of data for reputation profiling generally places some strain on the legal categories that we have. The CEO of Zest Finance, which it's got a partnership with the Chinese search engine Baidu, famously said that all data is credit data. So what does this mean for who we license and regulate as credit reporting agencies responsible for reliable information about people? If you take the website Spokeo, for example, now it's not a consumer reporting, credit reporting agency, but it lets its users search its data about people to find their addresses, their phone numbers, marital status, approximate ages, occupations, their hobbies, shopping habits, all that. That's all potentially relevant credit data. But in one case, a fellow called Mr. Robbins complained that Spokeo had incorrectly described him on their website as wealthy and married. He was applying for jobs and he wasn't getting them because he was seen as overqualified. And he claimed that they were actually a consumer reporting agency because they were responsible for accuracy of the data under the US Federal Consumer Reporting Act. So who should we be holding responsible under financial services laws for accuracy of information used for financial decision making? It's going to get increasingly complicated. Whether it can remain just the licensed credit rating agencies is really questionable. And then how sustainable is it that we maintain distinctions between formal and informal roles? If you take just a few weeks ago, the UK Information Commissioner just announced enforcement action against the credit rating agency Experian. Experian has been combining data that it gathers under its statutory powers with other data about people and enriching it and selling it onwards for marketing purposes. Very innovative, but beyond what it is statutorily supposed to do and beyond what it was telling the consumers what it was doing. So it, as a matter of enterprise governance, it's now going to have to manage its data under the enforcement rules that it receives from its statutory functions separately from any other data that it may gather. And there's some similarities to the Facebook decision that the German Bundeskartellamt took when it told Facebook it must segregate its data received from Instagram from like clicks and from the Facebook site itself. Now, so the point is that a credit rating agency like Experian is wanting to expand beyond its official functions using the opportunity of the data, but it's not able to do that, and others in the market are filling that gap. So the large volumes of big data that are now being collected and passed onwards. We know they're useful for analytics and then automated decision making. This is increasingly frequent in financial services because, of course, again, they're about just processing data. If you can do that efficiently, you can take on a credit risk on somebody and it can be highly profitable. Most of the concern there, though, is not so much about privacy as about the accuracy and the effectiveness of the algorithms achieving what they're supposed to do. So concerns about bias coming out of the training data that reflects legacy inequalities is going to continue to plague this area. We know that. That's really a question of how well the algorithms are working. Really, we just need them to work better. In fact, maybe they need more and better training data in order to get more accurate results. Where is that going to go? Very likely into increasing strict liability for outcomes as opposed to just showing that you have carried out an inclusive design process, because it's very difficult for regulators really to see the way these things are organized. A lot of this area is being developed through ethics, through bodies like the IEEE, for example, or regulators like the Singapore Monetary Authority has produced some very helpful fairness, ethics, accountability, transparency principles. Now, transparency and accountability for financial decisions is going to become increasingly challenging as a matter of data governance. I mean, the more machine learning, especially deep learning, is used, the more there will be the trade-offs between accuracy of the analytics and the outputs on the one hand, and then the explainability on the other. Now, this has been laid bare by the likes of Frank Pasquale, Cathy O'Neill, in fact, in her book, Weapons of Math Destruction, that Olivier just mentioned, which I also commend. So it's increasingly difficult to explain to customers why they were not granted a loan or faced particular charges. Hard to explain to regulators. How can you regulate what you can't explain? Some have been trying to come up with solutions to that, like Sandra Wachter and Brett Mittelstadt in the Oxford Internet Institute, suggesting using counterfactuals as a way as a sort of proxy or substitute for explainability. If you're able to tell somebody, well, if you didn't smoke and if you had earned 10,000 euros more, you would have had the loan or the insurance contract. But what I hear from the engineers is that the neural networks in the deep learning make it extremely difficult, really, to come up with counterfactuals in a reliable way. There may be more success in pursuing proposals to make sure ethics are really deeply built into the design of these systems, with participation, inclusive participation of designers all the way through. So we're going to see more of these issues. The EU is going to be publishing, I think, in the next few weeks, its new version of its white paper on artificial intelligence. A lot is going to depend, I think, on what can be dealt with generically, which a lot of our discussion has been in this session generic, as opposed to in specific sectors. Now, a lot of what I just talked about was very much consumer facing. Just two other things I want to touch on briefly. One is about competition, which came up as Susan was talking earlier. There are increasing concerns about that network effects, mechanisms of data collection, feedback loops, increasing consolidation of control over data. And that's not just Google and Facebook in the online advertising space. It's also happening in digital financial services. Of course, in countries like China, you already have huge consolidation in the likes of WeChat Pay and Alipay, highly consolidated, each serving over 800 million people. But we're seeing acquisitions by Visa of Plaid or Intuit of Credit Karma in the US now. Google's entering into banking arrangements with various banks, which is going to give it a lot of consumer data over their banking transactions. And so there is this concern that there's this kind of centripetal consolidation trend of data. So that may not be fundamental, may not yet be threatening us in the financial markets. That's to be seen. But it is another area where there are strains between legacy regulatory systems and new ones. Banks have control over data about their customers. That's long been seen as giving them advantages over their competitors. and lowering this barrier, regulators have been introducing open banking regulations, which require them to open up their data to make that available to competitors. We can expect to see more of that. The European Commission's been pushing that now in its proposed Digital Services Act to apply to gatekeeper platforms, really the big tech companies. We're going to see whether that can really work. Another competition concern is around algorithmic collusion, where the algorithms may react to one another and ultimately converge on mutually profitable results, which are not good for the consumer. The last point is that a lot of these issues that I've mentioned, which are either affecting consumers or potentially competition in the market, also actually are raising concerns about systemic risk to financial systems. So if we take the concern about consolidation of data and the sort of algorithmic herding, the collusion scenario, there are concerns that, for example, financial crises are very often caused by herding, by players all acting in similar ways. So we have the European Systemic Risk Board and other international policymakers are expressing concerns about increasing use of algorithms among interconnected financial firms, that could tip economies into major credit and liquidity crises. Now, we're back to parallels to Hayek's information problem. If there's an excessive uniformity of data and decision making through excessively consolidated control over the data and algorithms reacting with one another, we may have some very large-scale problems. So Financial Stability Board has been coming up with suggestions for how to deal with the explainability problem. It says, of course, this makes it worse. And there are other efforts to address through prudential regulation, have some deeper capital equity levels to be able to absorb some of these risks. And there's so much to do in this area. The point really is that data governance is now threaded throughout sector regulation and economic regulation in ways that require bringing together the information technology experts, the bankers, the lawyers, and the ethicists together. We're still in the early stages. There's plenty more to do. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Thank you, Rory. This is for this insightful, let's say, analysis. So you opposed, right, the fact that it is now, let's say, well understood that indeed millions of decision makers are actually doing a better job than, let's say, Sovietic planning, right? And I think on this, I would say more or less there is worldwide agreement, maybe, except maybe for the, let's say the politicians of North Korea. But apart from that, I would say this is now well understood. But these, let's say, considerations are maybe somewhat challenged by the brave new digital world that in which we are nowadays, as you pointed out, because of the consolidation, because of the herding of behavior. But there might be an additional threat that comes from the digitalization that I think you haven't directly addressed, and I'd like to hear you on this one, which is, let's say, fake news and misinformation and deliberate misinformation, so that little by little there is a growing risk that more and more people have a distorted perception of reality, right? And also with the success of online games and so on, little by little people in a way disconnect, and this might be on purpose, right, in order to gear them in a given direction for financial reasons or political motives. I mean, whatever, right? So what are your thoughts about that? Because you mentioned the other, let's say, risks, and I agree with them, but you did not insist on this one. Is it because you just by lack of time, or because you consider that they are less, this kind of risk is less relevant?
No, you're absolutely right. This is a huge risk, and it's clearly politically political systems a huge risk. In financial markets, I think it can be a risk as well, where rumors build and then reactions to rumors trigger follow-on reactions to those. And in the end, it may not matter whether something was true, as is often the case in financial markets. The fundamentals may matter less than the perception until there's a correction, and the correction can be a very painful crash. And so it is a concern. It's a subject that is also hard to track as to where its cause has begun. There are concerns amongst the international regulators that there could be triggers of financial crises by malicious actors getting these things started. We're seeing some efforts now. There's discussion in the US, for example, to amend Section 230, which is a provision which really gives a sort of immunity to internet companies for what's published if it's not being authored by themselves, if they're holding it as a platform. They have a sort of immunity around that now. There's a lot of debate whether the likes of Twitter, Facebook should bear some responsibility for the content and monitoring that, given the resources that they have. I think all this, coming back to financial sector, it's a very challenging question about responsibility for truth. There's historically, fraud is a basic type of law which is there to regulate truth-telling in financial transacting. That if you sell something on the basis of something that is not true, you state or you omit to state, and as a result you mislead somebody, then you've committed fraud, and that is not only a ground for repudiating the contract, but may well be an imprisonable offence in many situations. So that's a very core kind of discipline on responsibility for truth. And I talked a bit about credit rating agencies and this blurring line for who are we regulating and expecting to be responsible for that. I think we're going to have a real struggle trying to pin down broader groups as yet. I think the Section 230 may be helpful to some degree, but it's really only going to hit big issues, and most of the effort's going to need to come into being able to strengthen the firms that can discern and improve their reactions to the actual statements that are being made.
Thanks a lot, Rory. So maybe then moving back to Olivier's presentation. So you mentioned, Olivier, the role the C4DT has this program with startups. Could you say something about how you envision the role of startups with respect to the issue of digital trust, also in light of the fact that there are very, very prominent companies in this space, right, that are essentially dictating the industrial and to a vast extent political agenda. So what role would they play, and why did C4DT decide essentially to set up this program on startup companies?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I will paraphrase a French tagline from the 70s. Startups, they have no data, but they have IDs. So I think most working with a startup is really interesting because they are agile. They pivot. If they try something, it doesn't work, it's easy to change. They don't have shareholders value. They don't have to wait a long time before changing anything. So and also on specific topic, most of the time they have really talented people or expert on the subject. So I think it's clearly a win-win to have those startups associated, because it's a win for them to confront their ideas or their proposal to more mature companies, and it's also a win for the largest corporation or the mature company, because they get access to this agile thinking, to this expertise, and it brings the discussion forward, I'm sure.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Olivier. And then looping back to Jeff, there's something that you mentioned a little bit en passant, but I think it would be good if you could elaborate on that. So you mentioned confidential computing and why this is relevant to your company, but also to the sector in general, and it will facilitate the adoption of machine learning at some point. Now, as you pointed out, there can be hardware-based approaches and software-based approaches, and you have looked into the details of the two of them and the feasibility, the pros and cons. And hardware-based solutions are something that apparently you also take very seriously, considering that you're later this week you are talking at a joint event with Decentric, a company that is actually very proactively promoting hardware-based solutions, in spite of all, let's say, the well-known weaknesses, side channel attacks that have been documented and that appear again and again in the specialized press. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit how you see this dichotomy between software-based and hardware-based solutions?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, just to mention, from an R&D perspective, we're still taking more of a portfolio view, in the sense that we want to stay abreast of the trends in the hardware space as well as in the software space. The challenge, as you mentioned, with the hardware space is the fact that you still potentially have vulnerability in the data management process, which that could be an issue for regulators. I mean, that's a topic that is continuing to be debated. The software solutions allow you to have encrypted data from start to finish, and so you don't have that vulnerability. You pay for that in terms of speed and potentially the range of analytics you can do, although that particular constraint seems to be slowly going away. So as of right now, I think that we're hopeful that out of this mix of approaches, whether it be software-based or hardware-based, that we will solve this problem, because we see such huge opportunities in terms of unlocking data that right now is behind these privacy walls, as they should be. And the new machine learning analytics require interacting with the data at a level of granularity where you do need to figure out how to resolve that problem.
I understand. So in the long run, so what kind of solution would you see emerging out of this, competition?
Well, I think, I mean, it's hard to say. It looks like the software approach, as you know, has a lot going for it, assuming you can solve these potential problems around speed and flexibility. The hardware approach has a bit of a head start, because I think that it's out there a little more, but then you have the vulnerability. So it's hard for me to predict which one is going to win. I guess what I will predict is one of them, or potentially several solutions, will emerge that will solve this problem, and we look forward to that outcome.
Okay, and maybe a follow-up question is about. So we'll have to wrap up, I guess, very soon, but maybe it's going to be the last question to you and Rory, and so I'm not sure Olivier. I don't see Olivier anymore, but I trust he's still online. So the question, voila, here he is. You mentioned also the solution consists in adding some noise, right, to the. So put a bit of noise to protect privacy, right? So I'd be happy to hear what Rory thinks about, and how to what extent are people willing to accept this kind of solutions, which are indeed mainstream, right? So there's no question about that. But how would people react on the financial side? You say, well, the outcome is going to be a little bit blurred, because we need to put some noise in order to protect the privacy of the people whose data these results are based upon. So any thoughts about that, or is this something that is currently debated?
I think my thoughts will differ, probably, because this is differential privacy we're talking about, which is,
for example, yeah.
Yes, I've forgotten the name of begins with a D, who kind of came up with differential privacy. It's a mechanism of introducing noise and then removing it out. And as the noise is introduced, it conceals the identities. And I think the key question is it effective? Does it work? Yeah. In which case people shouldn't mind. I don't understand it to distort the actual data that's used for the analytical and the decision-making purposes. So as a policy or legal matter, I think, does it work? And if it does, good. And as a matter of trust, I think if people get as far as to understand it, they're probably going to end up trusting it if it does work.
For some reason, I got to, okay, very good.
I think I'm muted. Actually, I do have I think it's important to emphasize that the fully homomorphic encryption, that just from the perspective of security, that's the gold standard. Some of these other approaches have less protection. If we had people from each of the different groups, they would argue about the probability of that being broken or the data being accessed. And I think that's the real question. I mean, I'll end with one important point, and that is that we have to think carefully about the ability to probabilistically infer things about people. I don't hear people discussing that enough. So even if you can have all of this privacy protection, et cetera, there's still enough data out there that you can potentially infer quite a bit about an individual without actually breaching any of these systems. And the question of probabilistically inferring something about you is something that, I think we should be discussing that, because that's also part of this whole question.
Yeah, and maybe just for differential privacy, we have some research there at EPFL, and when I talked about the challenges and for the minorities, differential privacy could be a problem there, because if you have minorities, you have less data. If you have less data, the noise will change more the results, which means the result you will have will be less valuable for the minorities. So that's one of the problems we have in differential privacy.
Absolutely, and there have been very tangible results also in terms of face recognition and other applications that have shown this problem. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, great. And by the way, a quick comment on on what you just mentioned, Jeff. I agree with you, of course, that fully homomorphic encryption is a graal, right? But unfortunately, it comes with some issues, right? Some technical issues that make it difficult now to let's say, it requires still a certain number of precautions to put it in operation in such a way that performance is acceptable, and well, it's exactly the kind of issue that you and I are working on. Okay, it's 2 to 5 Swiss time, so I think we'll have to wrap up at this stage. So thank you so much for participating in this session, and well, we'll now move to the next one, to the final panel, and so I will then pass the floor back to Michael and Richard. Thanks again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Thank you to Susan, Jeff, Olivier, and Rory for an excellent final panel. Looking forward to the future practice of data governance. And now for the final and closing session, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Richard Baldwin, who is going to be moderating this final high-level panel. Richard?
Thank you very much, Michael, and welcome all to this closing session of what has been an incredibly rich day of informing, debating, and inspiring. At least I learned a huge amount what was going on. I hope I can get hold of those slides, and I know that there's been a recording of many of the sessions, which I think a lot of us will want to share with our students and watch again ourselves. This high-level panel rounds out the day with some wisdom from some of the world's most important thinkers on data. Now, I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second, but I'd first like to say a few words to set the scene, if you will. Data is organized information. And that means there's nothing new about data. So what changed? Why are we having this conversation? Why are we so concerned about it? My answer is that really is about the explosive advance of digital technology. Now, Michael Kendi started us out today, reminding us about the supercomputer that guided Apollo 11 to the moon and back in 1969. And he compared it to a standard smartphone of today. Now, the amazing thing is that today's smartphone has a processor that's literally hundreds of millions of times faster than the supercomputer in 1969 that guided Apollo 11 to the moon. But what he didn't say is that the increments in the advance are getting absolutely fabulous, amazing, astounding. For instance, the processing power that came out in an iPhone 6, which came out in 2015, was only half of what the processing power was in the iPhone 10, which came out in 2017. Now, if you think about that, that means that there was a larger increment in processing power between 2015 and 2017 than there was between 1969 and 2015. And that increment has happened a couple times since. And because these increments in processing power are so large, things that seemed plausible a few years ago are everyday phenomena now. And it is that explosive expansion of increments, which sounds innocent when you just say it doubles every 2 years. But when you think about the increments, they're explosive. That's what's really changed. Our ability to gather, transmit, store, and process data means that information can and is being used in ways that were unthinkable just a few years ago. The technology, in other words, has outstripped humans' understanding, and this very often happens with exponential curves. It happened, for instance, in Switzerland with COVID over October, where the thing just went up and the government couldn't react fast enough. Moreover, it has most definitely outstripped governance because governments work at a relatively normal human pace, not doubling the increments of speed every 2 years. And as a consequence, we find ourselves in a situation where things are happening to our societies that are uncontrolled in some sense. And we've heard many instances of it during the day, many hopeful ideas of how we're going to address it. But that's what I'd like to point out, that really we're here because of the explosive pace of digital technology. Data plus machine learning is reshaping democracies and autocracies, healthcare, epidemic control, economic value creation, market competition, national security, crime, terrorism, international trade, climate migration and adaptation, gender and ethnic discrimination, income inequality, privacy, education, psychological manipulation of consumers, and it's even affecting the brains of our children. That's really something new. That's forcing conversations all across the board to take it at a big level. This is really something that's central to the human experience going forward in the next 5-10 years. That's, I think, why we've had such interest in this discussion, and it's only one of dozens of conversations going around the world. So let me stop there and introduce the panel of data experts who really know what they're talking about on these things. We have 4 excellent speakers. The session is only an hour long. The first, I'm gonna just go through on the order in the program. Marietje Schaake, who's president of the CyberPeace Institute, more or less a private sector institute set up to try and help with governance. Daria Robinson, executive director of the Diplomacy Forum here in Geneva. Emmanuel Letouze, director and co-founder of Data Pop-Up Alliance, and Edward Bourguignon, who's professor and vice president for information systems at EPFL. If I can start with you, Marietje, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And maybe just a few words of clarification with regard to the CyberPeace Institute, which it's actually a not-for-profit, even though we have partners in the private sector, but also in the foundation sector and civil society, international organizations all over the world. But the idea is to really bring all those different stakeholders together to achieve something which I think is very much lacking in the digital world and has a lot to do with data, which is the fact that there is a serious and significant and worrisome escalation going on when it comes to the amount of attacks that are being waged between states, but also involving non-state actors. You may have heard about a topic which I think has not been receiving the attention that it deserves, which is the attacks on hospitals and labs right when they are scrambling to treat people with COVID, to prevent COVID from spreading and to find a vaccine. But what it shows is that the stakes are very high and that there are those who are willing to exploit vulnerabilities in the way in which technology is used as a layer that has become a part of everyday life. And even if I think there would be a scandal in most countries when, you know, rocks would be thrown through the windows of hospitals or burglars would force their way inside of pharmaceutical labs. When all of this activity happens online and when data is being stolen or compromised, or when it's being held ransom in exchange for money, too often we see zero consequences and accountability. And so what we're trying to do at the CyberPeace Institute, which is a role that I combine with work at Stanford University in California, is to get a better understanding of what the human aspects of the escalatory atmosphere in cyberspace mean. So the fact that there's actual victims and that it's not a technical discussion with abstract notions about software or geopolitics or amounts of money being compromised or systems that were vulnerable, but really to show that this is about people, that the digital is human. Secondly, to put more information about these kinds of attacks, so data, assessed from a multitude of perspectives into the public domain for a more informed public debate, more evidence-based policy making, all with the aim of pushing for more responsible behavior and accountability in cyberspace. I think the reality of, on the one hand, high stakes around the digital world and everything that countries are seeking to defend and promote there, combined with the promise of having a globally accessible internet, is now kind of coming into friction. And it leads to entirely new questions about how governance models that should anchor within them values, principles, norms, institutions that we know so well from the world before everything was digitized, should have meaning in the global context and in the digital world. And frankly speaking, the democratic nations of this country have actually lagged behind in applying their values and principles in a system, a model of governance that applies in the digital world. And I worry a great deal about the fact that there's so much dominance from either corporate governance, which I think is fair to say are the dominant players in the digital world, but also increasingly authoritarian models that are not only being deployed within the boundaries of those states, but also being exported and promoted worldwide. So we're really seeing a significant geopolitical battle where concepts that we think are attached to fairness, representation, legitimacy, accountability are not yet crystallized. And I think that that's something that we will all see unfolding in the next 10, 20 years. And hopefully this can be done in a way that respects universal human rights and doesn't create more friction, escalation of conflict, and can help defend democracy. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer questions or to engage in more interaction with all of you.
Thank you very much, Marietje. Maybe I can go straight on to Daria Robinson. I'm tempted to ask questions about these COVID attacks, which I haven't heard about, but it doesn't surprise me in the least. Whenever there's that kind of thing, these attacks are happening. Daria, can I just go straight on to you and ask you to make your opening remarks?
Yes, I would take a bit more of a helicopter view, or maybe, as you can see, a bit of a more of a space view from here. And having landed a few times, hovered around today, listening to not the highlights. I mean, you sort of pick and choose as you go in. And Interesting to really hear and learn more about this quite complex issue around data. And funny that you both, Michael and Richard, referred to the Apollo days, because it really is striking how, and from my first days in the European space program, where we brought humans to space with the Russians and the US, we indeed were working with simple systems. And when the US had really fun technology on the shuttle, yes, indeed, you could put that in your cell phone today. But the Russians said, why would we need to make it more complicated? We're using the same thing as Gagarin used, because, why make it more complicated? And now you see today, SpaceX launch, it's a fully touchscreen digital system where actually you're giving the astronaut the authority to choose the vehicle to actually pilot the capsule themselves. So we've gone leaps, and in fact, I think the analogy is interesting, because now we're finally given the authority to choose what we want, how we want to use these technologies and the data that we get from it. And it's getting more and more complex and more difficult to understand what it is that we're each individually see. I think it's looking back at the beginning, and what Mrs. LaSalle and Vitaly mentioned right in the beginning. You need to create spaces for collaboration and to steer technology for the benefit of humanity. And congratulations to both EHED and EPFL for starting this, because it's clear on the academic level, I mean, in all levels, but there's a clear need to bridge that way of thinking between the deep science, if we can call it, and the social science. And it's not because it's academia that those worlds understand each other the same way. What I heard really was, first you have to understand individually what we're talking about. What is data, for one thing? And you hear Robin Wilton was saying, it's not enough to have a good lock. You have to know what to do with the keys, or you have to be able to trust the person holding the keys. So the security issue is if you don't understand what it is that you're locking, then you're not really able to use the lock in the adequate way. Or you actually need to decide how to interpret the data. Kat Hearn was saying, it's up to us to interpret the data. Data is one thing, but we end up, if you're going from data, information, knowledge, decision, that is in the end where we as humans end up doing an interpretation along the way. And that again is a difficult task when you're trying to understand individually. And the population, I think it was Jean-Pierre Hubaux saying, the population doesn't understand what is at stake. And that's again because we are individually going to try to understand with the means that we have. So we're dealing here with quite a complex issue with multiple challenges, and it's not just because of where we look at from, but because of what it is intrinsically. And the next issue is really, building a solution together. Again, you're going to look at it, Jean-Yves Arth was saying, trust, you have to rely on multi-stakeholder approach. And so you have to break the silos. You have to adopt technology to better the COVID example of why wasn't there more people adopting the COVID app? Well, in the end, it wasn't that well explained to the people, and why not again? So society needs to be put into that. And that's about, if you're going to try to create solutions for that, you actually need to have this multi-stakeholder approach. So if I look at it from a GESDA perspective, GESDA being the very awkward acronym of Geneva, Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, where I run, as Richard introduced, the diplomacy part of it. But really it is about the science first, and how do you actually bring solutions for humanity out of the labs from a science-based solutions. And if I look at it from our perspective, you really have three main, I'd say, observations. The first is that when it's complex, you need to simplify. So, and in this world today that we're talking about, data and I think everything, you see this convergence of info, bio, nano, cogno convergence, and you see the other convergence of deep science, as we call it, and social and humanities. So you have these multiple convergence that not only the issue is difficult in itself, but then they're all interconnected. So how are you actually able to understand what's going on? So you need to be able to be mindful, but also be equipped with the right, I'd say, teachers to be able to go along. The second part, I think, which basically rules what we do at GESDA, but I think it's something that becomes even more interesting when we're talking about complexity, is the anticipation. We're talking here today about 2025, and in 2025, whatever we develop today, whatever we're speaking about today, well, will it still be relevant in 2025? And we need to do the foresight exercise of being able to look at solutions for 2025 in a context of challenges that will be real then. We're looking at 5, 10, and 25 years. So imagine the difficulty of the exercise of putting yourself, looking at what food security or what, I'd say migration or labor will be in 10, 25 years. It's a very difficult task. Like some of the previous panelists were saying, we're trying to solve today. It's hard enough to try to figure out tomorrow. And the last but not least bit, I think, is really about creating this common understanding. And unless you really are mindful of the different mindsets and make a real effort in creating this, I'd say, setup for people to start understanding each other, you'll never go beyond an acknowledgement of what it is into an action. So going from an ideation to an action, you need to actually be able to make sure people understand each other on their own territory. And it sounds trivial, but it's like if you're making a mayonnaise, I love cooking, so there are always food analogies, but if you're making a mayonnaise and you put the vinegar and the oil at the wrong time, you will have a great salad dressing, but you will not have a mayonnaise. So you really need to be careful about how and who you put in the mix at the right time and prepare each individual mix, each individual parties at the right time to do that. And so that's also typically something that we're actively working on. Is it's not just about the content, but it's about how you make it happen. How you make a solution happen is just as important, the mechanism, as to actually what it is that we're talking about. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, and we can go into those details later.
Thank you very much, Daria. So what I'm going to do is just move straight on to Emmanuel, or if you can unmute yourself and.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. So I had a couple of slides, but I won't really use them. I'm just going to show the first slide if I'm able to. And then I will share a link to the slides so that people can refer to them. But I'm basically, I'm not going to, so I'm just going to show that. Okay, so you should see the first slide. I mean, basically, yeah. So what interests me and what constitutes the bulk of my work is this notion of making data matter. So for human development and democracy, and you'll see, like, here the slides. So I'm not going to go over them, but they're there, and I will share the link in the chat. So just a couple of general points. First, in terms of context, I mean, obviously, COVID has exposed, laid bare, I think is the term maybe of the year, has laid bare fault lines, systemic fault lines in our systems. It has also exacerbated those fault lines, and we see that, of course, through data. And so it's obviously one way data is relevant. So it's as a lens on human reality. One of the questions that was asked is, what is data? So we don't have time to unpack all of that. I mean, data can be almost anything. A picture, a painting can be considered to be data. But I think a key point is that there is no such thing as raw data. I mean, there was a pretty good book a few years ago saying that raw data is an oxymoron, because it's always a choice that we make of how we represent the world, especially structured data, which are always answers to questions. So you have those cells and you try to answer some questions. So, and it leads me to say, to be discussed, that data is never neutral. So there is this this notion that technology or data are neutral in the sense that it can be used for good or bad, but I think it's never neutral because it always has some sort of effect. And so the philosopher John Austin said, saying is doing, and I think the same goes with data. Then some people mentioned some analogies. So there was I also like analogies quite a lot about sports or about different things. And so there was a bit the tired analogy of data as the new oil or the new black or the new everything. And so this analogy of data as the new oil has its limits, but I think it's still pretty good at capturing the risks, the perils of data when it comes to elite capture, to power imbalances, to environmental degradation, to leakages. And so I still think it's quite a useful analogy in different ways. So still going on analogy. So I mentioned data as a lens. So as a lens on the world, a lens that is that results from choices. You can think of the plateau cave that it's always a poor reflection of reality, but it's still the best lens that we have. But we have to be mindful of the fact that indeed sometimes it's very biased, that it's not because you have a very large N that is going to be representative of your sample population. And there's also a sense that when we have so many data, it can trump, pun intended, it can trump facts. And Gilles Lepore has this nice discussion about how too many data kill facts, actually. And it's, I think, something that is central, and is going to be central in the next years and decades. I'm also very interested in the role of data as levers or levers of change, how you can latch on data. How can data be a force for change? What are the conditions for that? To change mindsets, to change, to affect decisions. And this leads me to think increasingly that I view data as a language. So it's more of a proposition that I'm also making and I would like to discuss. I haven't really thought through the implications of considering data as the language of the 21st century, the way English was the language of the 20th century. But I think there is something to that when you think about data literacy, the importance of being data literate, of being able to communicate with, about, and through data. I think this is going to be critical, especially for the next generations. And here, one thing that really worries me is how kids are taught or not taught very well how to deal with data and technology. This has been a thread, I think, throughout. And the fact, it seems to be like a small, maybe a parenthesis, but the fact that so many schools are closed around the world, I think will have a lasting effect, not just on data literacy, but on the next generations of children. And I'm quite worried about that. So in closing, so I really see data as this language, as something that could reset or refuel democratic processes, that could fuel better human systems, better decisions, in spite of all the fears, and sometimes or very often legitimate fears that we have about data overload, about elite capture, about imbalances of power in the data ecosystem. But it seems to me that it's still some of the best, most powerful tool that we as human societies have at our disposal to reach certain objectives. And so, last, I would say, what are the conditions for that? What are the conditions for data and technology to be really used for the common good, to foster human development, maybe as embodied by the Sustainable Development Goals or other objectives, to protect and to promote democracy around the world? I really believe in democracy as government by discussion. democracy are not just elections, but they have to be respected, of course. People need to be encouraged to vote, not discouraged to vote. But it's really what happens between elections, I think, that is very important. So we need to have the ability to what I call dataify democracy. So to have more like fact-based discussions, but also to democratize data, to do that. And democratizing data means training people, educating people, but in a way that is respectful of people. If you tell people who don't believe in climate change, if you tell people who believe that the US election was rigged or stolen, and if you tell them they are stupid for thinking that way, then they're not going to listen. And so for data to play that role of fueling better human systems, there needs also to have a sort of like a human connection. So through trust and respect and empathy, so that this process of human learning can actually happen the same way it happens with the machine and with machine learning. And I think these are some of the points I wanted to make and how I view the role of data and how I think and hope that data can matter for human development and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. So too much data kills facts. I love that one. I'm still not quite sure I understand it entirely, but I'm definitely going to use it again. Let me move straight on to Edouard Bohn, Professor and Vice President of Information Systems at our partner EPFL. Please, Edouard.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great also to be last because we can have the benefit from everybody else's comments. And a lot of things were said. I'm actually going to focus on just 3 simple points. They're 2020 points. They're not 2025, but they're really about 2020. But I think we can learn a lot from 2020. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a diplomat. I'm an engineer. So I try to understand how the systems operate from an engineering perspective, and then see if we could derive some insights from effectively understanding what works and what doesn't work. I'm also an optimist. So sometimes I like to see the glass half full because I think it's helpful to also see things in a positive light. So my first point is about COVID. And on COVID, I think there are 2 dichotomies which I'm optimistic will be proven false. I'm not sure they'll be proven false, but I'm optimistic they'll be proven false. The first one is the dichotomy between health and the economy. Now, if you go beyond the politics and the bare knuckles politics and posturing in certain parts of the world, including the United States, this was a legitimate debate. And the reason why, in my mind, it's actually a false dichotomy is one is, of course, you cannot fight an exponential growth of a virus with linear methods, right? You need to change the game. So there is no choice. But also it's because the economy managed to be resilient because so much is digitized. So much of the economic value creation cycle is based on digital processes where we actually add value through digital means, information of various forms, and exchange it, allows the economic cycle to actually remain somewhat resilient and not fall apart in the context of a pandemic. And just to put this in perspective, prior pandemics had a much bigger impact on economic growth than this current one has. So this is the first point of optimism in the context of COVID. Likely a false dichotomy between health and economy, and therefore makes also simpler policy decision-making in terms of how to respond and make appropriate adjustments in the context of fighting the virus. The second one, which I'm also optimistic will be proven false, is that there is a legitimate desire to use digital data and digital means to build some form of a disease surveillance network. I don't mean a police surveillance network, but a disease surveillance network. And there is a postulate dichotomy between building such a network and the privacy of data and the privacy of citizens. And there I'm also optimistic that at the end, we will come out of this pandemic, at least in democratic societies, with the notion that we actually can learn about the evolution of the virus, have the appropriate methods to contain the propagation of the virus, and we can implement methods without violating the privacy of citizens, without creating some massive, non-reversible surveillance network using digital means. Now that second one, I'm not sure if I'll be proven correct, but again, I'm optimistic. My second line of remarks is about, and I think this is something where became absolutely apparent in 2020, is the massive importance of platforms. And as an engineer, what's important to realize is that the internet was not designed as around a set of platforms. In fact, it was absolutely designed around a notion of aggressive decentralization so that we could have resilience within the network. In fact, the internet is built out of so-called autonomous systems. Nobody, unless you're a networking geek, nobody really understands what an autonomous system is. But the internet is built out of autonomous systems. What we actually have today, what our common interaction with the internet is the interaction with actually a very small number of massive platforms. These include the 2 platforms we can choose from for our phones, the 5 or 6 relevant platforms for social networking that are used by everyone, and a few platforms used for collaboration or video conferencing, right? These are a small number of massive platforms. Now, these platforms are, there actually are an intriguing and somewhat disturbing points of control. Owning a platform actually gives an advantage. Some will claim an unfair advantage, but certainly I think it's fair to say that there is a massive advantage associated with owning one or multiple such platforms. Now, these platforms have a role and play a critical role in the governance of our digital lives because they're used to spread information, disinformation. They can make decisions as to what is allowed and what is not allowed. It's actually interesting how the mobile vendors can play a huge amount of role with allowing or not allowing applications that do certain things, some which might be relatively innocuous, some which may be conflicting with the platform owner's own strategy and vision. And this is simply bare knuckles business. But in some cases, applications that effectively go against the political will of a particular government. And the TikTok debacle is kind of a weird example of that power. The interesting thing, I think, from this forum and this audience is the fact that there's a fair amount of thought that is being put from a governance perspective that is very US-centric, about the US-centric management of data. There is on Twitter, for example, government accounts from the P5 are labeled as government accounts, right? Now, Switzerland's not a P5, right? We're actually hoping to be a whatever it's called, the 15 top, right? And NP10, I guess, but we're not the P5. We'll never be the P5. The point is that there is a hierarchy as managed by Twitter in this case, with respect to how they consider government officials of various countries. And of course, this goes absolutely against any notion of multi-stakeholder discussion. There is the US management, and then there is, in this case, the P5 sort of management set of rules, and then there are rules for everybody else. And of course, this is a big problem for democracies and countries outside of the US because we're beholden to the governance regulations of these US platforms for things that are actually purely internal national matters. There is a well-known fact in the most recent election, not votation, but election in Switzerland. There was a political ad that was taken down on YouTube by one of the Swiss political parties. Right? It was taken down by YouTube, and the reasons why it was taken out were probably legitimate. At least let's assume at face value that there was a legitimate reason. But the point is that this is actually not YouTube's business, right? There should be a way for the Swiss political parties and the Swiss democratic process to actually determine what is an appropriate ad and what is not an appropriate ad, and have a way to basically take down inappropriate ads irrespective of the platform. So we have a platform view rather than having a government view. And when you look at it today, for better or for worse, these massive platforms are treated and must be treated as non-state groups. Right? We treat them as non-state group the same way, non-state armed groups are part of the conversation in a multi-stakeholder discussion or a diplomatic discussion in many events. These IT platforms are non-state groups, and they are effectively must be engaged with in the same way we engage state entities in the context of multi-stakeholder discussion. They're not all ready to have these conversations. I'll give an interesting factoid. Twitter managed to block the official account of the BACOM, the OFCOM, the Swiss Federal Office of Communication, a few weeks ago. And that was a side effect of some semi-automated process that basically just cut off the account. Turns out that nobody within the Swiss government has any way to reach anybody at Twitter that actually can revert the decision because we don't have diplomatic relationships with Twitter. Twitter is actually a reasonably small company. And those types of issues will become more and more apparent because we need to have a way to engage with these platforms, including at a government level. So that was my second point about the rise of platforms, not anticipating the original internet design, probably too powerful today with not enough governance, either from their perspective or from our perspective, and not knowing how to engage with them. And the third one is actually going back to the issue of sovereignty and relationship between countries. It is and this was mentioned, this was one of the big themes today, it's the debate on GDPR and Safe Harbor, Privacy Shield, Schrems 1 and Schrems 2. And I'll just share that one slide because I actually think it's brilliant. And Max Schrems said we could share it. So let's just share it, right? On the left is actually Microsoft's most recent response to Schrems 2 with an update as to what their regulations are. We're not going to go through it one by one, right? But it's basically Microsoft doing what you would expect out of a professional, responsible company to update their policy, communicate with their customers, and present their approach to privacy, of course, in the best possible light. And on the right, we have Max Schrems' hand annotations as to what this actually means. And in some cases, he's actually giving Microsoft credit for moving the discussion a certain step forwards. And in other cases, he's actually highlighting the fact that there is no way legally that Microsoft will be able to bridge the gap because there is a fundamental incompatibility between the US legal system and the European legal system when it comes to extraterritoriality. And that is enshrined in two important pieces of legislation. One is the Cloud Act, which Microsoft, before the inception of the Cloud Act, was going all the way to the Supreme Court based on the Stored Communications Act to defend the privacy of European customers. Of course, they went to the Supreme Court and then the Cloud Act that made that entire exercise moot. And now we have the Cloud Act, which means we actually do not have strong guarantees. And then the second one that came out, of course, and that came out, I believe, out of the Obama administration, I'm not 100% sure anymore, is the FISA 702 regulation, which basically provides the ability for the US in secret to demand access lawfully to data that would otherwise have to go through treaties. Now, of course, that is restricted issues and matters of national security, but it is an irreconcilable set of views between the US-centric view and the European-centric view on data privacy and IT. So we have these three things, right? We have a technology that works, and I'll claim that it actually works in the sense that it's actually part of the answer to COVID, both from a health perspective, public health perspective, as well as from an economic resilience. We have these massive platforms that should be treated like non-state groups that actually do not have the maturity of non-state group, and for whom states do not have a real maturity in how to engage them as non-state groups. And then we have this third aspect, which is we have this sovereignty issue between states, not coming to a mutual understanding as to how to articulate in a symmetrical way their mutual responsibilities. And that, of course, puts all of us at some level of insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Those are extremely stimulating comments. And what I'd like to do, if I can, Marietje, is I know you were a member of the European Parliament, and through a lot of today, we've heard about European standards, perhaps setting the stage in the world. But Eduardo was just talking about how the US standards are also important, especially since the internet, the big platform companies are inside the United States. I wonder if you could react a little bit of how you think this is going to, or your view of what Edward said and Europe's role in potentially putting this together.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think I think it's interesting to see how much traction there is on the part of governments to start governing the digital world. For a long time, the EU was sort of leading and felt alone, maybe lonely in doing this. If you're asking me about my personal experiences of serving in the European Parliament for 10 years, you know, going to Silicon Valley was a very surreal kind of journey, because I'm a liberal in the European sense. So, you know, centrist, not a believer in big government if it's not necessary. But I was easily accused of being emotional, as Europeans are, about the right to privacy, so, you know, as opposed to rational, or that it was a typical socialist / communist thing to propose, that there should be, you know, laws protecting people's privacy. And of course, it's always good to remind Americans who think that these are tools against tech companies, that these laws serve first and foremost to protect people from abuse of power by governments. And so what is interesting to observe, if you look at the sort of longer term trends, maybe, you know, last 20 years of tech development and the last 20 years of government responses, is that there is a lot of catching up happening. And let me touch a hopeful note for a moment, because I've, you know, spent years feeling very frustrated about the fact that the democratic world and democratic governments seemed to neglect the high stakes when it came to democratic values, were unwilling to anchor a number of principles that Edward also mentioned in rules and institutions and accountability mechanisms. But now I think there is a reckoning happening. In the space of antitrust, which I also think is really important, you see a lot of US activity when it comes to attorneys general looking into Google. You see efforts both in the legislative work in Congress when it comes to updating antitrust rules for the digital era. You see the same process happening in the EU. And now, interestingly, some steps being taken in China. And so this will inevitably lead to positioning, and I hope stronger cooperation on the part of democracies. And then, of course, the whole question of privacy, where I think there's a rapid catching up happening in the United States, especially compared to Europe. Activity and activism around facial recognition bias, which will also translate into questions around artificial intelligence, have led to legislative initiatives on the local level. And so while I see that the EU is perhaps further along in articulating its vision, I think it has no time to lose to translate that into not only meaningful oversight and regulating of other companies, but also in growth within its own economies. I think it's crucial. You cannot base a governance model only on regulating others. But with the Biden administration, perhaps a window opens again for more structural leadership transatlantically, and hopefully involving a democratic coalition globally, to make sure that the rule of law and democracy retain any form of meaning online or in the digital world with regard to the digital world. It is actually one of my biggest concerns that between a privatized governance model and an authoritarian governance model, democracies are squeezed, and the very essences that have defined our quality of life will simply be eroding, and people won't even notice it as they're using all these tools, services, gadgets, and platforms for entertainment, for efficiency, and whatnot. So I think it's a very urgent agenda, and I believe it has many aspects where when I'm hopeful, I see convergence. When I'm not hopeful, I see the private sector and authoritarian governments setting the rules and democracies falling behind even further.
Thank you very much, Marietje. So let me go back to Emmanuel on this theme of platform economies and privacy. And you talked about datafying democracy, but I think it's possible to say, for instance, in the Brexit election and potentially the 2016 election, that data identified people specifically and then sent them particular messages that in essence, undermined democracy because it fragmented what people thought was reality. So that wasn't really data helping democracy, but data actually being used to more or less undermine democracy. How would you react to that? But also if you feel like reacting to what Marietje said, about the US, the private sector, the China, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll try to be succinct. So, yeah, I mean, we've gone through a couple of weird years over the past decade with upsets in elections, and so you're referring to Brexit and I guess Cambridge Analytica. So the first thing is, recently I read a paper that sort of went against, I believe, the notion that Cambridge Analytica had a major effect on the outcome. So I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I think it would be worth looking actually at to what extent it actually had an effect. But it's, I mean, if we believe in data and facts and want to base our discussions on some facts. But of course, there is no doubt that this is happening. It was used first by, I think, the Obama campaign of 2008, I believe. So in the very early years of sort of like, the uptake of big data. And indeed, I believe it's a real risk. So this sort of like, active outreach and so showing people some selective facts and sometimes alternative facts, so to speak, and the system can be gamed. It's very systematic in the sense that we all know that the business model of Twitter and Facebook, I mean, Facebook in particular, it's all based on a number of clicks, etc. So almost by design, it leads to this polarization. So even we don't talk about necessarily like, alternative facts or spreading fake news, the fact is that like polarization, which can be about like real facts, but if you see only one perspective, there isn't this kind of discussion happening within societies. And so my hope, I'm also optimistic we have to be, is that we will be able to, I still believe in this notion of data-fying democracies, meaning data-enabled discussions on the basis of facts. And you can discuss, we disagree. Okay, like, what are the facts? And let's discuss. We talked about platform, and I will just end on that. There is a discussion going on about online digital parks or something along those lines. So, and the question there is, how are we going to be able to have the kinds of fact-based, respectful, civil discussions that used to happen in parks or in bars or in restaurants or in public parks, where you meet people who think differently. And today, if we move increasingly to a digital world, I mean, digital platforms are not very well suited to these kinds of discussions. I mean, you are behind your screen, we insult each other. I mean, we try not, I mean, I don't insult people online, but it's like, oh, you have an avatar, and so I'm really trying to think of what could be the mechanisms for having those kinds of fact-based, respectful, civil conversations on the basis of facts. So I will just stop there. I can answer. I haven't answered the question about privacy. I mean, no, I've touched on it, but implicitly.
Thank you very much, Menya. So what I'd like to do is next go to Daria. In essence, you were arguing that we need to create a common understanding. And if you've been listening for the last 10, 15 minutes, doesn't seem like that's going to be a very easy task. China, private companies, democracy under risk, European views of privacy. How do you think we could or potentially create a common understanding on the sorts of things we need to govern a global internet?
Well, I think one of the key, I'd say, solution is exactly what you're doing. And I'm not talking about our conversations, but I'm talking about this EPFL IHED experiment, or I'd say new initiative, because it's by training, I think, the future, not even generation, but the current, the generation of those who are going from data to transforming the data into knowledge and to decision making to be multiply trained. And it's it's really, you know, the academics are the ones who create the knowledge. And I think by having this sort of multidisciplinary exposure, I mean, we know we know an engineer thinks differently than a lawyer, and then an astrophysicist and a psychologist. And that's what's so cool about having so many different perspectives. But if you can actually start creating this early mix of mindset at the stage of where you're developing your knowledge, it's certainly going to stand. And we see at least with our kids in the Swiss school system, they learned how to recycle stuff. You know, I remember my son coming home doing the triage of the PET and the aluminum and stuff. They learned without having to, you know, be told about it, and now it's just part of what they do. So if the earlier we start, of course, the more it becomes part of the mindset. And I think that helps not only, I'd say, bridge that gap in terms of culture, because as Marietje was saying, you know, you go to Silicon Valley, you're on another planet, and in the same way, it's not just the difference in the way you think because you're trained as an engineer or as a psychologist, but it's actually also because you come from a different culture, a different religion. And again, men, women, we all think differently. So it's not just about the topic. Again, it's about where you come from and what age you are. And so, but one of the, I think, easy solutions is exactly what you're trying to do, is bridge that gap very early on. And then to start, I mean, I see for what we do and we're trying to do is that you need to take players who really want to do it. So of course, you start with the low-hanging fruits and those who are really into it. And then you go with very small selected circles, and then you do the snowball effect, because you know, it's a permanent fine tune. And when you mean understanding, it's not about dumbifying. It's not about making the science or the governance topic more, I'd say, you know, if you're going to try to explain what quantum computing is to someone who's not in the technical field, and even in a technical field, you're not going to explain what it is and, you know, how it actually functions, but you're going to actually explain the impact of it on, you know, your country or your life, etc. So you really need to find these examples that are relevant for the other party. And for that, you need to have done this effort of being on the other side of the bridge. And because we're all very specialized in our areas, we don't, you know, we're not interested, or that's not what we do. So you need these people who can do this translation bit on these multiple fronts. And that takes, I think, a certain, you know, a mix of people to help the mayonnaise take.
Thank you very much for that. Now, Edward, your incisive and insightful comments sparked all this commentary. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to react to what everybody said. And then with a few minutes left, I'm going to go through each of the panelists and ask them, what is your forecast? Is the world of data going to be more fragmented or less fragmented by 2025? So the other panelists, you can start to think about that. Edward, I'd like your reactions to the reactions.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few things that stand out. One is, yes, Silicon Valley is a bubble. I actually lived there for 18 years. You live inside a bubble, and that bubble has its own value system. And that value system, it has a reward system, it has a value system, it has a pecking order. It's a very small community. It's surprisingly actually small in terms of people involved in any kind of leadership or thinking position within Silicon Valley. Then there's a lot of people who basically get highly paid to do, you know, things that they're very good at doing, which is building, you know, various forms of computing technologies. But it's a relatively small ecosystem. And even though it is an ecosystem of immigrants, it is actually an ecosystem that has zero understanding of how the rest of the world operates. And I've spent many years trying to reconcile this. How is it possible that, you know, I work with people that come from Ireland, and they come from, you know, China, and they come from India, and they come from, and yet they're unable to sort of understand how the impact of US technology and the US set of legal systems actually impacts how their own technology is perceived and deployed in their own home countries. It's a little odd, and that's part of it is because the U.S. is such a good place at attracting people. The melting pot does work, and then people forget that there is a home perspective, and there are people very deep in their technology stack that have lost that perspective. I hope Marietje will never lose that perspective. I'm hopeful you will still remain European in your thinking and understanding European policy. But that certainly is one of the things. It's also the fact that it's too complicated to worry about other countries. Right? The US is a huge market. This was mentioned on this chat. You can make or break any kind of a platform on the US market alone. So that's where it starts. In a way, that's where it ends, and everything else is a side effect. I think what we're all sort of having a little bit of angst about is the fact that the exponential growth of computing power and computing capacity, which was mentioned earlier in the panels, right? This exponential growth is a concept that's actually very difficult for people to internalize. And we actually learned this in the context of the virus. But we now have a system that has grown faster, bigger, and has more emergent properties that we could anticipate. And the people that have built these platforms have long lost control of the emergent properties of their own platforms. So the notion that like there's somebody at Facebook that actually controls the terrain and controls the rules and the algorithm is completely false, right? They don't have a clue what is actually happening on their own platform. They're not that interested in what's happening on their own platform. And the example that I think is the most clear example that can never be forgotten is the role that Facebook played in the Rohingya genocide a few years ago, which basically happened. It happened using technology. Of course, nobody's accusing Facebook of having designed their platforms to aid and abide by genocide, right? Nobody's making that accusation. But the reality is they created a platform, the platform was abused and was used in unanticipated ways. And one of the things that we must do, right, potentially post-crisis or use this crisis, is use the opportunity to sort of slow down the temperature and reduce the temperature and make sure that the rate of innovation and deployment slows down a little bit so that governance has an opportunity to catch up. Otherwise, we'll be in this position where we will always be trying to catch up to the latest and greatest technology. And there, I'm a little, I'm not very optimistic. And the reason why I'm not very optimistic is that the COVID crisis has laid a few things bare in many countries. And one is that they are not, as administrations, as resilient, as digitized as they thought they were. And so my guess is that the countries will spend the next few years trying to get their own acts together with respect to their own digitization and actually try to find ways to collaborate with the tech giants rather than to be focused on the governance of the digital interactions of the world.
Thank you for that. So now I'm just going to run through more cohesive or more fragmented data governance or data practices. What's your guess? I'm going to start with Marietje and go in order.
More fragmentation, more confrontation. Not my hope, but it is my expectation.
So that's China, US, Europe, or you see more blocks?
Own interests. I mean, I couldn't agree with everything that Edward said more. It's really actually fun to hear very similar thoughts expressed by someone who I haven't met before. But I think the stakes are very, very high. And I think that the private sector is beginning to play a governance role in and of itself. And so the question really becomes, how will the American government and American companies, the European governments and European and other companies, but also the Chinese government and Chinese companies relate to each other? And what will that lead to? Who will set the standards? Technically, who will set the governance norms? Who will build the institutions? In the chat, and I was trying to multitask, so forgive me if I wasn't all that sharp, because there's a whole parallel discussion emerging here. But this notion of public-private partnership, the notion of multi-stakeholder governance, you know, so much of it becomes an instrument in the hands of the private sector. And I don't want to, we can't discard the private sector in the digital world, but the question is, what direction do we need to go? And in my opinion, we need to go into the direction of strengthening the public sector and the public interest, public values, democracy, universal human rights. And as Edward said, I think, or Edouard said, I think what what we need to understand is how much risk is being plugged in real time by, for example, the kinds of unpredictable outcomes that AI and data processing may lead to. And this notion of slowing down a little bit could also help the learning on the part of the public, because otherwise we also are creating a huge knowledge gap, not just a power gap, data gap, money gap, and other kinds of agency gaps, but also even an understanding of everything that we're talking about here, which the understanding and learning does not automatically flow back into the public. And I think that that's a real problem, because anything from education to a well-informed debate to evidence-based policy making to accountability and the very agency of the individual, stands or falls with their ability to even grasp the world that they live in. And so how do we ensure there is this kind of transparency and meaningful access to information, I think, is a crucial question. And since the stakes are so high, I don't think it will come easy for that to flow back into society out of the boardrooms and the labs and the companies.
Thank you very much. Daria, what's your guess? More or less integrated in 2025?
Well, I'll 2025, it's too close. I mean, I think we don't have time to change in 5 years, but I think we have time to set the basis to change in 10. And unfortunately, I think Edouard, I know it's the half full glass, but slowing down to catch up is not going to happen, and we know that. We'd love that, but it's not going to happen, and it's running behind us, and it's becoming, as I said in the beginning, everything's converging on top of it. So we thought we knew, and then tomorrow we don't know anymore. So so there's catching up on multiple sides, and so. Yeah, I think we do have a hope to get there, but I don't think we can get there tomorrow, i.e. in 5 years, but by putting the right, I'd say the right mix together. And I think the private sector, as Marietje said, it's this whole public-private partnership thing is, it's a big buzzword and it's very important, but again, you need to exactly use it in the right way. And a lot of private sector companies are not necessarily using it for the right purpose. I mean, you really need to look for purpose-driven organizations, I would say, and those who are actually there to help implement and make sure to help in the adoption of whatever is going to come through. So yeah, you have to handpick your partners in this stuff.
Thank you very much. Emmanuel, it's your chance. More or less fragmented in 2025?
Well, so first of all, I don't really know what more or less fragmented means. And so, so that's one. Second, I agree that 2025 is, tomorrow. So I'm looking more at, 10-year or maybe a one generation window. We talked about in multidisciplinary, etc. I'm a demographer by training. And so I tend to think in generational terms. And also in historical terms. So if you look at the first industrial revolution, it was very bumpy. I mean, we have this idea that all of a sudden, living standards like rose, and it was, the end of the dark ages, etc. But people lost their jobs. Life expectancy was shrunk for several generations. And so it was a really, really tough time for a lot of people. And so we are today in this fourth industrial revolution. It's really just the beginning. And so I want to remain optimistic that there are some bumps. We have to learn from the past. And so I want to remain optimistic. There was in particular in terms of how, like what that means or what is required for data and technology to play a progressive role. So we talked about public-private partnership. I like the notion of public-private people partnership, so not PPPs, but PPPs, where people refers to civil society, NGOs, the media, and I think increasingly they play a key role. I was just end by saying what makes me optimistic is that I see all around the world, and we've talked a lot about US, Europe, China was mentioned, but the world is a big place. And so there are lots of initiatives bubbling in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the MENA region, in Asia, in Latin America, like startups, NGOs, and people. We can see the sense of, I think we have to take this opportunity of COVID, this crisis, to do a reset. So not a reset a la World Economic Forum, but you know, everybody wants to build back better. So I want to ask, you know, where were you 10 years ago? I mean, this was all there. And so, yeah, I want to remain optimistic. It's a question of culture and values. Like, I think the world responds to what we think is disgusting. And there were things that seemed disgusting to us 10 or 20 years ago, and this got changed. And today, when a CEO makes 1,000 times the average income of one of his employees, this should be seen as being disgusting. And then we should say, like, no, that's no way. Thank you very much.
Now, we are a little bit over time, but I wanted to give Edouard the last word. I can see Michael's concerned that we're over time, but we have the pro Zoom, so they won't cut us off directly. So please, Edouard, not too long ago.
I'll make it very short. I think we will be more fragmented. That was the first question, but we will also be more vertically integrated. And the technology stack is getting more and more vertically integrated, which means that you need to pick your root of trust. And your root of trust will determine way more about your rights and obligations, privileges, and the size and shape of the walled garden that you will be in. It's already the case today. It's going to get worse. And now, for better or for worse, we are, as if you take the example of mobile phones, right? We have largely US-based roots of trust in terms of operating systems and CPUs. That we can have some level of flexibility and choice. And these companies are trying to protect our privacy as individuals versus that of governments, with some success. And in the future, we'll see that there'll be less and less transparency, more and more integration, and that these root of trust will not always be US-based and be more and more foreign-based, which actually will create a whole new set of issues that we have not yet anticipated.
Thank you very much. So I'll close very quickly. This is definitely not the end of the conversation. We will continue on. I'm sure we could have done this for another hour or two, but I'm going to kick it over to Michael to close up. And I want to thank all the panelists. Again, we can't clap on the internet, but if I could, I'd give you all a great big hand. Thanks. Michael, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a fascinating session and a fascinating day. I'm just going to wrap up very, very briefly, given the time, with kind of after all of that, a bit of a prosaic observation. From one of the panels, we learned that in Switzerland, just 22% of people are using the contact tracing app. And the #1 reason people aren't using it is because of a worry about data protection. So in spite of all the other purposes that they're giving up their location for, that they're, I would argue, getting far less for than protecting themselves from this disease and their loved ones, they're not using it. So I think that just gives an extra urgency that if we can't address this in the middle of a pandemic, we need to give a lot more thought and attention to broader issues of data governance for now, and to create all of these new apps and uses for 2025. I'd just like to thank all the speakers in the audience and the organizers. This was co-organized between the EPFL and the Graduate Institute. Professor Jean-Pierre Hubaux, Olivier Crochat, and Marietje at the EPFL, Richard, Professor Baldwin at the Graduate Institute, along with Tamara Pierney, Michael Omumbwa, and Simran Sinha at the Graduate Institute. Thank you very much. Just to build very quickly on what Daria said, one of the goals of the day indeed was to break silos and to bring together different stakeholders from within our institutions. And many of the speakers confirmed the need for the hard and the social sciences to work more closely together. So we were happy that we started this collaboration between the institutions on these topics. More broadly, in September, the Graduate Institute released a report with the Fondation pour Genève about internet governance in international Geneva, defined broadly to include the Lake region, which highlighted the role of Geneva as a hub for digital governance. And since then, the Swiss government released its new digital foreign policy strategy, which seeks to place Geneva even more at the heart of global digital policy issues. I think our event today was a good illustration of what the region can deliver and why this strategy is important. And to build on these efforts, just finally, we're incubating a digital governance hub at the Graduate Institute in Richards Center. And that would be in position to continue to carry out the work that we started today and other key topics in a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder fashion. I think today was a good proof of that concept, and we look forward to continue to work with all of you on the key topics we covered, with our hub playing an important role going forward. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. All the recordings will be online, and we'll put up all of the presentations for anyone who's willing to share them. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you very much.